Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Mustard, and my presentation is Analog Preservation in Community Archives, an Autoethnographic Approach. I'm going to briefly review what community archives and autoethnography are and how I'm using autoethnography to approach this project. Then I will discuss my interviews with two community archives and the data that I collected. A disclaimer: this approach is very experimental for me and reflects my desire to show the process of my learning rather than to present myself as completely competent. Community archives can be thought of in many ways as grassroots, community owned, community controlled, but most importantly, they are archives that collect, describe, and make accessible the materials of a community's own choosing on its own terms. I've listed a few examples of community archives, and you can see there's quite a range of possibilities. Community archives can sometimes have fewer employees with formal archival or preservation training, which is somewhat different from larger institutional archives, but they often struggle with time and money, which is similar. I have been interested in community archives for about a year now, and I'm still working out why that is, and this project is a part of that process. I will be presenting my research about analog preservation in community archives through autoethnography. Autoethnography is a methodology that pursues the ultimate goal of cultural understanding underlying autobiographical experiences. In this context, cultural understanding is a developing understanding of analog preservation practices. Autoethnography has three main aspects: systematically collecting data that is analyzed and interpreted, searching for an understanding of others, uh, on a broad scale, culture and society through the self, and personal experiences as primary data. So in this presentation, you will see these three aspects: data that was collected from two anonymous community archives, an attempt to understand the broader ideas about how community archives work, and my feelings and experiences about and with the research process. And just as a disclaimer, another disclaimer, the triadic model, the ethno, the auto, and the graphy are not equally emphasized in each section, but I have attempted to address them all. I began with an interest in community archives about a year ago, and from that began my initial research. My typical approach to new topics is to appear competent and knowledgeable until I actually am competent and knowledgeable, at least on some level. So I was expecting this presentation to be some advice to community archives about how to improve their preservation practices. This motivation perhaps came from the residual feelings of confidence from the preservation assessment. These are three observations that I had, but they are not chronological. My initial observations were not encouraging. I was met by a lack of information that I had expected to be there. There was very little scholarly literature available, which made me confused, and I panicked about what I was going to present about. To address those feelings, I reached out to colleagues of mine who I felt were supportive and might donate some of their time. At this point, I had still planned to give advice and guidance. If I was going to give information and guidance, it would need to come from somewhere, but there was also a lack of a centralized place to get information and guidance, and what was available was overwhelming, and that would be difficult to provide to my colleagues. How would I be able to accurately and efficiently provide information that covered all of what would be necessary? So I decided to focus on the resources that I had used most over the course of the semester, even though I felt it would not be comprehensive, and I was upset about that, but assumed I would have a better answer later. And finally, I was not able to find any preservation policies for community archives online. I had really expected them to be there and then started to feel that they should be there, but I felt stuck because there were no scholarly resources and no actual archives that I could find preservation policies for. It was at this point that I decided to interview two of my colleagues about their community archives, and I assumed I would still have advice for them. I would use my experience and knowledge gained in this class to help them. So to do this, I started with the preservation program elements from Ritzenthaler and the Patkus assessment guide, which, because I was familiar with them, the information was clear and I could appear competent. And I could use the preservation program elements like a checklist that would inform both me and my colleagues of what was missing from their preservation program. I created an abbreviated questionnaire from the PATCUS, and which would serve as my data collection and form the basis of my recommendations. I realized at this point that I was recreating the preservation assessment assignment and was unsure if that was really what I wanted to do, but I went ahead anyway, hoping that something would become more clear as the research process went on. I interviewed two colleagues, also friends. One was employed by a local history collection in a public library, and the other at a cultural heritage center. I suggested they be anonymous because I felt they might be afraid of being judged for not having optimal preservation practices. I created an abbreviated questionnaire of some of the higher level questions, and the analysis of those questions will be shared on later slides. I wanted to know what they knew about preservation, what kinds of policies they had in place, and what preservation activities they carried out. Each of these data collection elements also represented an aspect of my own personal interest and experience. The questionnaire represented the knowledge I had gained from previous assessment assignment. The connection to my colleagues represented the breadth of my working connections. And my offer to discuss questions over Zoom represented my flexibility and appreciation. And towards the end, I decided that I would share resources, which would also reflect my appreciation and my desire for them to get something out of this experience. From this questionnaire, I determined that they both had a preservation policy, but it was not written. Employees and interns know what need to be done, but it is not formally written. Neither had a preservation assessment completed because of this cost associated with it. Both had clear plans and priorities for their preservation goals, though again, they were not formally written. But those plans were integrated into their long-term and short-term projects. The local history collection did have staff and researcher training because of the local history librarian having an MLIS and extending that knowledge and training to employees and interns, while the Cultural Heritage Center did not have someone with this training. The Cultural Heritage Center did have environmental monitoring equipment because part of their collection contains musical instruments which are used and have to be maintained. Though it was identified that the local history collection could benefit from environmental monitoring equipment, the option was not available due to the budget. The local history collection did have a duplication and reformatting plan, and those items are outsourced to a vendor. This was not applicable for the analog items in the Cultural Heritage Center. The Cultural Heritage Center had participated in emergency preparedness planning, but did not have a written policy, and neither did the local history collection. The local history collection participated both in conservation treatment with outside vendors and with some activities in preventative preservation. The Cultural Heritage Center does its own conservation on its textiles, but can send both textiles and instruments to experts for repair and conservation. These were the four resources that I decided to share with the two community archives, which are basic, but they were not aware of them. This did help me to feel more competent, and also showed my appreciation for them taking their time. Here's a little bit more detail about each collection and then the analysis and synthesis of the data about these two community archives. First, the local history collection contained mostly paper, books, photos, and newspapers. The most popular items were deed books, church documents, documents about clubs, and an African American oral history project. They received 3 to 4 visitors per month, but more access their collections online. Their preservation policies are not defined, but there are clear guidelines and processes that come from the local history librarian who has an MLIS. Employees and interns take part in basic preservation tasks like refoldering and removing staples, labeling, and storing. There is no natural light in the area, and the access and use policies are clearly stated for the visitors. The preservation challenges identified were not enough storage space for oversized materials, no monitoring equipment, and they were not aware of any preservation resources. Returning to the triad, this is sort of a reflection on what I learned. I learned that when I feel uncomfortable, I return to what I know and feel confident discussing. I was relying on my connections and friendships to to complete this project, and generally I'm okay with doing that. About community archives, or the ethno portion of this, I learned that employee training has a huge impact on preservation practices and that fear of judgment of preservation practices may prevent community archives from publicly displaying their preservation practices. And reflecting on the research process, I learned much more about the community archive, my colleagues' role in managing parts of it, and the specific obstacles they were encountering, more so than in my email with the cultural heritage site. I also noticed that this was facilitated by the familiarity of my friend, but at the same time, I noticed a power imbalance as I knew more about these preservation practices and they did not. For the Cultural Heritage Center, to present that data and those reflections, the collection is mainly musical instruments, textiles, and some paintings. These items are meant to be touched, used, worn, held in order to preserve the culture that they represent. They are used up to 20 times a year, but are mostly interacted with online as they are recordings of the use of these costumes and musical instruments and oral histories that are available on their website. Their preservation policies extend to the care and mending of textiles and instruments by local craftspeople, environmental monitoring equipment where the instruments are stored, along with climate control equipment in that area as well. There is no natural light and they use LED bulbs. Their staff has completed county office trainings for disaster planning, and they are also aware of resources from the Library of Congress. The preservation challenges they identified were a lack of storage space, lack of funding, and lack of formal training. So again, returning to the triad and what I learned. For this collection, I realized that I needed to do further research about these types of materials and the cultures they came from in order to become more competent. And similar to the local history collection, I was aware of my reliance on my connections. For community archives, I realized that decisions have to be made based on the needs of objects and that some objects are used to preserve the culture the culture they represent by using them rather than storing them. And in reflecting on the research method, I learned that I needed to ask follow-up questions, especially for this interview because of the specific needs of the objects and their approach to preservation through culture. And my questions from the preservation assessment did not really reflect the fact that using these objects preserves the culture, and without using these objects, the culture might not be preserved. And now I'd like to synthesize my findings for the research questions and to address my initial observations. The gap in scholarly literature is not actually a gap because research really isn't necessary where there is guidance on sound preservation practices. Also, there is a lot of research about preservation, but it's focused on digital preservation, as many community archives have the problems identified here, lack of space and lack of funding. And my initial frustration with the lack of scholarly articles and the fact that digital preservation was out of scope forced me to learn more about community archives, which was the point. To address my frustration about no central location for preservation resources, I think that there should be more outreach to community archives from these institutions, which may already be happening, but I do not know if it is. And even if a community archive knows about the resources, it doesn't mean they are necessarily able to use them due to staff, budget, or space issues. And I was able to help these archives somewhat by sharing these resources with my colleagues, which made me feel as though it was worth their time in some ways, and in some ways fulfills that outreach function. To address my frustration that preservation policies are not always publicly available, I learned that while archives may not have formal written policies, they may have standardized preservation practices, and they may be hesitant to be transparent, especially if they do not have optimum standards. This made me feel less dogmatic about the availability of these policies online, and that the awareness and use of preservation practices greatly relies on the education and training of employees or administration. Overall, I found that three themes guided both the research question, my methodology, and the interpretation of my findings. The first is competency, which I felt after completing the preservation assessment assignment, but I was challenged when I was not able to find what I was looking for, and I consistently worked to feel competent. That manifested in conversation with my colleagues and in experimenting with this methodology. I also learned that while my continuing interest in and knowledge of community archives continues to grow, I still do not know why I'm so invested in them. And the final theme is community, which is fairly on the nose, but it does accurately reflect my personal community of colleagues, the cultural and historical groups that are represented in these collections, and the institutions that collect, protect, and care for them. Now for a few discussion questions. What are your thoughts on autoethnography as a methodology? Was this an effective way to approach the topic of community archives? Would you ever use this methodology in your research? Why or why not? In what ways can preservation policies create obstacles for community archives? What preservations would you have for a community archive you are considering donating your personal or family papers to? And do you have any experiences with community archives and their preservation policies or approaches that you would like to share? Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please feel free to answer with any thoughts that you have.